I'm very happy to introduce the great Ethan Nadelmann, as he's here with us and is going to have a conversation which makes us to get him know him better, together with Ina. Ethan is described by the Rolling Stones as the point man for drug policy reform efforts. He is widely regarded as the outstanding proponent of drug policy reform, both in the United States and abroad. So give a warm welcome to Ethan Nadelmann and Ina.
I'm okay. Hello. It's good to be in Oslo again.
I forgot my microphone.
Okay.
It's so nice to have you here back in Oslo,
Yeah.
Ethan. What is it, 5 years ago now?
Yeah, 5 years ago, but I think this is my 5th or 6th time here, so but it is very nice to be back, and it's nice to see all the progress that's happened now. I mean, that's truly inspiring.
Thank you so much, and you're perhaps the most famous the world's most famous drug policy reform activist, and you having found and run Drug Policy Alliance for 17 years?
Well, in some respects 23. It started with a different name, but yeah, for a long time.
So what would you say is the most memorable moment from your time there?
You know, I mean, when you're building an organization and playing a role in a movement, there's all sorts of moments, you know, when you realize how the whole thing could have just blown up, and the sort of insider politics that sometimes, and funding issues where somebody's trying to destroy everything you've built. But I think in the positive sense, probably the one that stood out was the very first ballot initiative we won. You know, my beginnings in the late 80s, I mean, I had studied drug policy. I'd actually worked in the State Department's Narcotics Bureau. I'd sort of interviewed drug enforcement agents around the world. And then I started speaking out in the late 80s, but it was all very academic and intellectual. And then when I started what became known as the Drug Policy Alliance, an opportunity emerged in California where some local activists had drafted a ballot initiative, a referendum, to legalize medical marijuana. And, you know, in California, it's a huge state. You know, even back then, it was probably 35 million people. You need to run a ballot initiative costs money. It's a major thing. And I was in a fortunate position to know some very wealthy men, and to know the grassroots activists, and to know the professional campaigners, and, you know, and to shift very quickly into leading a sort of political effort from behind the scenes. And so on Monday, I'm flying to California from Oslo to celebrate the 25th anniversary of Proposition 215, the first medical marijuana initiative in the United States and maybe in the world. And I would describe that as the moment at which the nascent drug policy reform movement showed that we could play ball in the major leagues of American politics. And if you look back at a lot of the reform in the US and even to some extent globally, it was a pivotal moment because it was the first time we won something real through the political process. It shifted the tenor of the debate around marijuana. It opened up the possibilities for looking at marijuana legalization, which happened, you know, 16 years later. It shifted the US government's posture. That then shifted the role of the United States globally. So in some respects, a lot does date back to that.
I want to talk to you about arguments because I read a book by psychologist Jonathan Haidt called The Righteous Mind, and he writes about how an audience with different values respect to very are receptive to very different arguments. So, in your experience, which arguments of drug policy reform resonates with the most of each type of audience?
You know, it changes over time. I'll give you just a few examples. The arguments around racial justice in America were not very prominent in the late 80s, at the height of the drug war in the 90s, and the beginning of the 2000s. And I had a challenge because sometimes I would argue the drug war is devastating black inner city communities, but then black leaders would say, who are you, some white intellectual telling us what's going on? Drugs are killing us. We have to crack down. But once sentiment began to change in the black community, first with state-level politicians, the book by Michelle Alexander, The New Jim Crow, things like that really began to transform it. So now racial justice is playing a very important role, both on broader drug reform and also on cannabis reform. A second example is when we were doing, I'm trying to think, the ballot initiatives to legalize marijuana for all adults in Colorado and Washington. And that was a collective effort. There were a whole range of organizations. And I remember different groups had different messages they liked. Some wanted to talk about marijuana and using it as an issue of personal sovereignty, my freedom. Others wanted to talk about the argument that marijuana was safer than alcohol. Right? Others wanted to talk about the racial justice piece. Others wanted to some other. And people were emotionally committed to their message. And all the messages were correct. But we reached an agreement among the leaders who were involved in the effort, which was for all the organizations, until the beginning of September, say whatever you want. But from the beginning of September until Election Day at the beginning of November, 8 weeks later, we all agree we're only going to run with the messages that work best in our public opinion testing and polling. And those two messages were the message, we'd rather have the police going after real criminals instead of arresting young people for cannabis, and we'd rather have the government taxing and regulating this instead of having the gangsters make all the money. And those were the arguments which we knew would move the people who were in the middle, who were undecided. And we were disciplined about that strategy, and I think that played a role in the victory.
You and Drug Policy Alliance have also been key players in the legalization of cannabis debate. So when do you see cannabis reform happening at the federal level, and which states would you say have the best regulatory models?
Well, I think the best model right now, the gold standard, certainly in the US and maybe globally, is New York, my state. And I'm very proud because it's my successors at the Drug Policy Alliance who really led this. But what it is, I mean, first of all, New York is the only state in America where you can walk down the street and you can smoke a joint openly anywhere that a cigarette can be smoked. I mean, that's extraordinary. I mean, the day after, and it entered into effect right as soon as the law passed. So the very next day, I went and I sat outside on Fifth Avenue across the street from a police car, and I lit up my joint, and I said, this is the meaning of freedom. And that freedom, And that freedom applied not just to me as an older white man who the police would not normally look at, but also to young men of color whom the police are always looking at. But I think also the thing about New York was they had the benefit of learning from the experience of other states. Other states had been trying to get the taxation level right. The issue of equity, where those communities and individuals that were most harmed by the drug war, that the tax revenue, there should be benefits from them, there should be training programs, there should be capital to help them. So how to make all the commitment to racial and social equity real, not just for, poor communities of color, but also for veterans, for traditional, marijuana growers, all that sort of stuff. And it was also a very good political moment where Drug Policy Alliance had been building up support for years, where the governor of New York, Cuomo, who had been a problem on this, was politically weakened because of scandal, so he could not get in the way, where the Democrats, who had been more supportive than Republicans, were now in a substantial majority. So we hit a magical moment, and that was really I think the key. In the federal government, I've been pleasantly surprised at how quickly support has grown, especially among the Democrats. On my podcast, Psychoactive, I had Chuck Schumer, who's the New York State Senator, who's also the majority leader of the US Senate, so one of the three most powerful political figures in America right now. And I was almost a little embarrassed that he was taking 15 minutes away from the big political issues of the country to talk about marijuana on my podcast, but it was a reflection of the fact that the majority leader of the US Senate is now a co-sponsor of a bill to legalize marijuana. And there's two things holding it up. Well, one is that even the Republicans don't want to support anything the Democrats do, and sometimes vice versa, although not quite as extreme. Secondly, even with the Democrats, they're not all on board. There's some of the old school Democrats. But I'd say for federal legalization, you know, it could be 3 or 4 years, could be 6 years. One of the issues is that there are some people in the industry, marijuana industry, and even others, who aren't sure they'd want marijuana to be legalized at the federal level. Because once you legalize at the federal level, then the big alcohol, tobacco, pharmaceutical, and consumer goods companies will be able to get fully involved. I mean, there's now big business in marijuana, but they're small compared to the huge multinationals. Once it's legalized federally, as has happened in Canada you now have big alcohol and big tobacco playing an increasingly dominant role in the marijuana business. And for many of us, we're not so happy about that prospect.
Just to follow up on that one, what state do you think has the best cannabis regulatory model? If you don't just look at the US, but all the countries in the world, do you think there is one country that has like the best solution for it?
You know, it really has to be localized. I mean, Uruguay has a really hyper-regulatory model. I mean, it's a type of model that probably, you know, makes Steve Rolls just feel ecstatic about, you know, because, you know, I think Canada, you know, it breaks out a little bit provincially. You know, I think Quebec maybe got too hyper-regulatory in a way. And there's not that many states as yet. I'll be curious to see. Switzerland is kind of going very tiptoeing towards it now, but I was just there 2 weeks ago, and I think, you know, they're at risk of imposing too strong a public health model on the whole thing. So I really do think that people should look at New York State right now as a model for much of the world, because it's driven by a strong social justice and equity consciousness. It's conscious around public health concerns. It understands that, you know, that capitalism, competitive markets are inevitably going to play a role in that in most countries. And I think, you know, at least in the United States and maybe many other countries, nobody really believes in the federal government having a role in agricultural production. I mean, the countries that control agricultural production in global history are some of the more notorious regimes and have oftentimes mangled things quite badly. But I think a strong role for government regulation and the right forms of taxation is important.
You've also been engaged in the regulation of nicotine, and many countries are imposing very strict regulations on nicotine vaping. So what do you think about this trend? Do you think that nicotine will be an illicit drug in the future?
Well, you know, it's interesting. I paid attention to the issue around tobacco harm reduction for many years. But when I stopped running Drug Policy Alliance 4 years ago, this was the issue that really drew me in. And for a few reasons. The first one was that it reminded me so much of what drew me into drug policy reform in the late 80s and early 90s, which was that the more you looked at the scientific evidence, the public health arguments, the human rights arguments, the economic arguments, all of that, the more it suggested that tobacco policy, tobacco control policy should be, that harm reduction should be front and center. Recognizing the continuum of harm between the most dangerous, you know, smoking cigarettes or chewing tobacco in the developing world, and on the other hand, the heat not burn devices, the e-cigarettes, and then snus and nicotine pouches and things like that. And that there's a real continuum of harm that we all understand coming from illicit drug harm reduction, but that the broader population, you know, which is demonized understandably cigarette smoking, but now begun to demonize nicotine. And so I was really drawn into this, but the other thing that happened is a few years ago, there was a huge jump in the use of Juul, the e-cigarettes, by teenagers. And oftentimes teenagers coming from the wealthier communities, whose parents didn't smoke or they hadn't in a long time, and the parents were freaking out. But basically, many of the liberal politicians who had been my allies on legalizing marijuana for medical and broader purposes, on harm reduction, on safe injection, on needle exchange, on reducing incarceration, they were pushing for banning e-cigarettes. And literally saying things like, better to prevent one teenager from starting and becoming addicted to e-cigarettes that would be better than having 5 adults die. And, I'm remembering, and they're actually using the old anti-marijuana arguments. Michael Bloomberg, my former mayor of New York City, who was pretty good on public health issues. And, but he's literally taking the old anti-marijuana rhetoric about the adolescent brain, the gateway theory. All these things, which I would describe as sort of an ounce of truth embedded in a pound of bullshit. And now they've been discredited with respect to marijuana, and they're applying them to tobacco and nicotine stuff. And you see in the tobacco control community a split, where all of these people, academics, activists, who are fighting against the evils of big tobacco and fighting for tougher policies on cigarettes, all of which was the right thing to do, and then they've now split with one group that is kind of small and feel, intimidated, saying that harm reduction has to be central. And on the other side, the mainstream, well-funded by Michael Bloomberg and the government and other foundations, basically becoming no longer being focused on reducing smoking and the harms of tobacco. They now have become so obsessed with fighting big tobacco. That's their number one objective. And the more they try to put a stake through the heart of big tobacco, the more they play into their hands and impede the transition to the less dangerous forms of tobacco consumption. And they've also become abstinence-only ideologues. We in harm reduction know what it means that we're not just dealing with criminalization, we're dealing with abstinence-only ideology. And now in the tobacco field, they've gone from being anti-smoking advocates, good thing, to becoming anti-nicotine. And remember the whole rhetoric, a drug-free world, we can do it? That was the motto of the United Nations General Assembly Special Session in 1998. You look at that motto back then, and you wonder, what were those fuckers smoking, right? And now you have this anti-tobacco folks going, a nicotine-free world, with 1 billion people around the world consuming nicotine in one form or another, right? With 7-8 million people dying from smoking. If you could snap your fingers tomorrow and all the smokers in the world were to switch to e-cigarettes and the heat-not-burn devices and the snoozes and the patches, it would be one of the greatest advances in public health in global history, right? But you have this ideology, and it makes me sad, because you think people, they finally get it about harm reduction. But no, they came to it for other reasons, and we have to educate them again. So I'll be damned if having, got into this age, playing a role in the legalization of marijuana and now psychedelics and decriminalization of all the illicit drugs, and I'm going to go to my deathbed with a whole new global war on drugs directed at tobacco and nicotine products? No way.
You mentioned your podcast, so I was just wondering if you can tell us a bit more about it and what's your plan for the future?
Yeah. I tell you, when I stopped running Drug Policy Alliance, I thought, that's what I'll do. Because, nice thing about doing a podcast is it's not like teaching a course where you have to be someplace every Tuesday and Thursday, or like a radio show. And, but I just wanted to take it easy for a while and stop talking about drugs after 30 years of talking about nothing else. But then last year, there's a movie director I know who's been a little bit helpful to our efforts named Darren Aronofsky. Some of you may know his name from the movie Requiem of a Dream about addiction, or the movie Black Swan or Noah. And he emailed me, he said, you want to do a podcast on psychedelics? And I said, no, I want to do a podcast on all drugs. And he said, let's do it. And then it turned out he was doing a contract with iHeartRadio, which is the biggest podcast, platform in the world. So we got going on it, and I'm having a blast. Please all check it out. It's called Psychoactive. It's on Apple and Spotify and everything else. But, it's basic. I don't get to pick all the guests myself. They want me to do this, and we'll get, maybe movie actors and comedians, but I want to get some of the intellectuals. But so there's been about 17 episodes so far, and some are with people like Andrew Weil or Michael Pollan or Carl Hart, whose name you may recognize, or it might be with politicians. I had the former head of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, Nora Volkow, on, and I grilled her harder than she's ever been grilled. But also, that, and so I'm loving it because, I'm reading books, I'm listening to other people's podcasts to see what they're like. It's got me re-engaged, and I've always been curious about drugs, but now I come here and I go, I wonder if I want to try to get them on the podcast, or I wonder if I need to do a show on what's going on in Scandinavia, or I want to, now my co-producers may say, Scandinavia, Ethan? I don't know, but we'll see, we'll negotiate, and in time, I hope to get to it.
I can assure you, there's a lot of people here loving your podcast as well.
Good.
I read in an interview that you met him. There was something about an ibogaine ceremony. The guy you talked about that you joined you collaborated with the podcast. Was it something about the ibogaine ceremony?
No, it wasn't ibogaine. I have not done ibogaine. I will admit I am really impressed by the research, but I'm still scared of trying it. No, it turned out it was a friend of ours, a guy named Ganga White, had taken me and then also this movie director Darren on each of our first ayahuasca journeys. And so we had that common link of having both done it with the same guide in Santa Barbara, the United States. So that was the origins of that.
So you've been to an ayahuasca ceremony?
Oh yeah, no, I've done ayahuasca numerous times in different settings. Yeah. No, ayahuasca is a good one. The UDV, the Santo Daime experience was, different in a way, but I did have what felt like a telepathic experience on that first thing where I was communicating with somebody, bizarrely, it was one of the billionaires who was a very important funder of our work and who had a really difficult time with me. He was always stopping and supporting. But I, in my heart, I knew there was no way we were going to succeed in legalizing marijuana unless this guy accepted that we needed this partnership. But he had told everybody he wasn't want to work with me or anything. And for some reason, on the ayahuasca, I began thinking about him. And it was almost like this sensory, doing this emotional sensory feeling of what he was doing. And I began drafting a letter in my head to him, and it was all about even, because he was an older guy, a father-son relationships and trusting and letting go. And it was this emotional, like this sort of thing. And the next day on the plane back to New York, I wrote the letter, but nobody had seen it at all. It was just sitting in my computer. And a few days later, out of the blue, he had only called me once in the previous year to yell at me. He calls me up and he says, Ethan, I'm going to give you some money to do this work. And I said, why? He goes, well, first, because my respect for George Soros, who was a major supporter, but also just to tell you, I love you. Okay, well, Peter didn't know about ayahuasca, nobody else did, and so could be coincidence. But that sense of that telepathic connection, I sometimes call that my $1 million, ayahuasca experience. Because not that it cost me, but it brought in $1 million for marijuana reform. Yeah.
You mentioned the Open Society Foundation, and I know that Drug Policy Alliance received support from Open Society Foundation. Can you talk a little bit about the significance of that support in the field of drug policy reform?
Well, I have to say, what happened, it was the summer of 1992, so before many of you were born. And I had already become a public figure. I was teaching at Princeton University. I was speaking and writing about the need to end the drug war and all of this. And I got a phone call from a guy named George Soros, who was not famous at that time. He was a wealthy man. He had been a major philanthropist in bringing down socialist dictatorship in former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. And so he invited me to lunch. And we had a 2-hour conversation arguing and all this. And at the end of that lunch, he says, well, look, I see we basically agree on the key issues. We'll have our differences. But let's assume what I want to do is to empower you to accomplish our common objectives. And so I went home and wrote him a proposal. And a few months later, he became famous because he broke the British bank, in his investments. But then we reached a deal. And so I became his principal advisor on drug policy for about 25 years. And first building my organization within his foundation. Soros, at that point, when he started, his perspective was really coming at it really from two perspectives. One was as a businessman with an economic way of thinking, who realized the absurdity of trying to criminalize commodities in global markets that everybody wanted. I mean, we had that experience in America with alcohol prohibition. And from his perspective, if you have tens or hundreds of millions of consumers for something, to put the police and the military and security agencies in charge of that just seemed like a recipe for disaster, which we also knew it was. And the second was from a human rights perspective. I think that when communism fell in the former Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, in the late 80s, early 90s, Soros was an advocate of the open society. And he had always believed that the United States, and to some extent Western Europe, were the models of the open society based on the philosophies of Karl Popper and the reactions to fascism and communism. And I think when he asked himself the question, well, what in the United States is inconsistent with open society ideals? And the first thing that hit him between the eyes was the war on drugs. That the war on drugs, like the models of socialist dictatorship, were ones that basically seek to infantilize adults, treat adults like children, that rely on universal surveillance, that encourage the use of informants and undercover operations, that makes science subsidiary to basically the government's needs, that play on fears and xenophobic fears, that rely on incarceration. And so that was what connected him to it. And his views have evolved over time, but what was significant was that he became really, and he didn't know anything about harm reduction. And so I taught him about harm reduction and how that had to play a pivotal role in all this. So that led to the creation of the International Harm Reduction Development Program at Open Society Foundation, and then a global drug policy program. And then eventually I spun my organization out to create Drug Policy Alliance. And Soros has been far and away the key funder of drug policy reform, both in the US and around the world. Now, what's happened in the US is that a whole range of other funders have now come out on the marijuana issue, psychedelics, racial justice, sentencing reform. But unfortunately, globally, there's a real, others have not stood up in the same kind of way. And right now, when we were getting started in the 90s, basically open society values were breaking out all around the world. And the drug war stood as the big exception to that. Now, when you see open society values under threat, from Trumpism in America and Bolsonaroism, and you look around from Venezuela to right-wing regimes, and you look what's going on in Poland and in Hungary and in Russia and in Turkey and the role of China, you see open society on defensive. So unfortunately, Soros Foundation is now pulling back on its commitment to things like harm reduction, even though it strongly supports it. And Soros has had such a special connection to drug policy that it's still seen as a legacy project within the broader $1 billion a year foundation. But I think he and others are feeling that they need to focus on preserving not just a rational drug policy, but preserving open society and democracy and human rights more globally, taking on the bigger threats. So that's unfortunately the trade-off that's happening now.
Soros and OSF has been portrayed as public enemy number one in authoritarian countries like Hungary. Are you concerned that cultural conservatives will mobilize to stop drug policy reforms?
Well, it's been a remarkable transition in the U.S. because, for many years, drug policy reform was regarded as what we call the third rail of American politics. Third rail, I don't know if you have that expression here, but it refers to the third rail on the subway tracks, which is electrified, where if you touch it, you get electrocuted. And so drug policy reform was seen as a third rail. But remarkably, when Trump was president, in 2018, I think it was, there were almost no bills that went through the Congress, both houses of Congress, and were signed by the president that were bipartisan. And two of the great exceptions were the one to eliminate the mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenses, and the other one was to deal with the opioid issue in a more generous and public health-driven way. And those passed with bipartisan support. So I have a feeling, and then if you even look on the marijuana legalization, you see that it's not just the liberal states. South Dakota voted to legalize marijuana overwhelmingly. That's a very Republican state. Mississippi just legalized medical marijuana by a big margin. So we managed to cross over into the right wing and the cultural conservatives in some pretty good way. And on psychedelics, I mean, I don't know, I mean, even there you have interesting support from some of the Republicans. I mean, you know, republicanism in America is becoming almost a form of, it is becoming a form of neo-fascism. And I don't use that word fascism lightly, but for the first time in America, we have the emergence of a quasi-fascist movement that's taken over the Republican Party. And I'm not one who uses that word lightly, right? But nonetheless, there are even people in that camp and some of those supporters who are like, hey, legalize marijuana, reduce the prison population, psychedelics have a role. So we may have crossed over to the point where, you know, we can somehow escape the culture war. You know, I mean, they lost the culture war with respect to gay rights, and I think they've lost it on some significant elements with respect to drug policy as well.
For drug policy reform activists here in the Nordic countries, you're a role model, and I was wondering, what is the most important lesson you have learned that drug policy activists here in the Nordics can learn from?
I think the most important one, sometimes when people get involved in activism, they think that activism is just telling other people in the world openly and honestly exactly what you think and telling them what the damn truth is. And what I've learned is sometimes, oftentimes, no, right? That whatever the issue is, the specific drug policy issue, you have to frame it in a way that people can grasp it. You know, you have to understand, you know, as Steve Rolls was saying earlier, that oftentimes the opposition is driven by fears. Fear around their children, fear around minorities, fear around the political consequences, you know, you name it. And so the key is finding the ways, oftentimes, in which we find the way to hold the hands, not of our most bitter opponents, because they're beyond persuading, but of holding the hands of the people who are afraid of reform, are afraid of decriminalization, afraid. It's of using the language that will appeal to them. You know, sometimes Drug Policy Alliance, my own politics are somewhat center-left. Much of my staff was even more to the left. Sometimes I would find them using what I would call liberal speak, left speak, you know, and starting to use language and code words unconsciously, but as soon as somebody coming from the center or the right saw that type of language, that terminology, they were just turned off. So therefore, it's about using simple language that can speak to people from wherever they're coming across the political spectrum, not using the buzzwords of the left or whatever it might be. You know, it's, you know, one of the great teachers of harm reduction in America was a woman named Edith Springer. And she had a way, who had been in recovery and then come to harm reduction, and she had a way of going to speak to groups that were all about abstinence only, 12-step, drugs are evil. And she would ask the people helping people dealing with drug problems to talk about what they were doing. And she would find something in what they were saying that was similar to what she was doing in harm reduction. And she'd go, but honey, but darling, you're already doing harm reduction. You know, it was seeing that, you know, it was the appeals to conscience. And it was also thinking opportunistically. You know, sometimes when all of a sudden a politician or somebody who's prominent in the media or a cultural, when they're ready to step out, just get them the support they need, regardless of where they're coming from on the political spectrum. Or conversely, when the opposition goes too far, when they do something that shocks the conscience, seize on that moment, because that's the moment where even though most people don't support drug policy reform most of the time, they know that thing went too far. When we started doing medical marijuana and also treatment instead of incarceration in the mid-90s, it's because we saw that most of America supported most of the drug war, but a majority of Americans said that that treating people as criminals for using marijuana for medical purposes, that went too far. Or locking up people the first or second time they got arrested for drug possession, even if they were not serious criminals, that went too far. So you run with the bit you have, you build confidence. I also will say, there are those who say, should we take the compromise now? If we take the compromise now, won't that undermine support for the broader objective? And my general experience is most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time, it's better to take the compromise, to take the 2 steps now, and to try to frame that incremental success in terms of what the next step is. I would sometimes say, there is no Berlin Wall of drug prohibition that's going to come where the walls will get crumbling down and all of a sudden things revolutionarily change. There is no 18th Amendment of alcohol prohibition that will be repealed by a 21st Amendment, which is what happened with alcohol prohibition in the US. Incremental reform, we have essentially no alternative to that. And therefore, it's to pursue incremental reforms, but always keeping in mind how they relate to the broader strategic vision, so that the compromises you make don't end up getting locked in. So that, as Steve was saying before, you make sure you're taking 2 or 3 steps forward and only 1 step backward, not 2 or 3 steps forward and 3 or 4 backward. And I think that's not just one lesson, but it's a number of lessons I've learned over time. And one of the things that really strikes me coming back to Norway now is how much you have just sort of intuitively been doing all of these things. I mean, you're operating at multiple levels. You're building coalitions among groups that are focused more on cannabis or psychedelics or incarceration or decriminalization or human rights. You're using different tactics, from engaging the elites to engaging kind of grassroots groups. You're learning from what happened abroad, but also putting it into a local context and a local advocacy language. All of those things are the right way to go, and I think it's why Norway, and I was very encouraged. I was in Iceland about 6-7 years ago, and to hear the progress in Iceland as well, and even to hear, the Swedes and from Finland, I mean, America may have been the evil empire of the war on drugs for a century, but I sometimes think of Sweden as, Singapore in Europe when it comes to drug policy. But you're on the right path, and I do believe that incremental, step-by-step victory will happen.
Thank you so much. We are running out of time, but I want to ask you one last question.
Yeah.
What is your favorite drug? and what is your least favorite drug?
Well, I mean, least favorite, I probably have to admit, I've never been a big fan of cocaine. I've tried it many times. And I just, it doesn't, for me, like having cocaine is like drinking too much coffee and having postnasal drip. I mean, there's certain particular settings where cocaine can work nicely in a short way. I won't get into that. But I mean, apart from that, maybe I'm fortunate that I've never had a taste for that. I am, in some respects, a marijuana and psychedelics, exceptionalist. I mean, marijuana has been part of my life since I was 18. I'm now 64, and it's been my friend, and for a long time. And I've never been a daily consumer, but it's been something I love. And then among the psychedelics, I'd say mushrooms. I mean, mushrooms is the one thing that I'll do high dose. I really do believe. Sometimes we'll say I think that psychedelics are wasted on the young. I think that people should make an effort to continue to do psychedelics at least once a year as they get older. It's a way of stirring up the emotional sediment, of keeping oneself honest. I once said that, as somebody who's Jewish and a little bit traditional, every year on Yom Kippur, I fast, 25 hours, no food or water. And I think it's kind of good for the soul. And I feel that way about taking psychedelics at least once a year as well. So I'd say those. But I should also say that in being a marijuana and psychedelics exceptionalist, I want to be clear that I think that the principle of personal autonomy over our minds and bodies, and the principle that decriminalization must apply to all drugs, is absolutely pivotal. When I go and speak to psychedelics audiences, that's what I drive home, because so much of the psychedelics world in the US now, unlike I think here, is only interested in the psychedelics, and they see them as this elevated drugs, which they are, but at the same time, it's just like in America, we have our First Amendment. It's the thing that's kept us, free and who we are in a good way. The freedom is over speech, press, religion, and assembly. And those freedoms don't just apply to the elevated speech, the good speech, the beneficial. They even apply to the ugly and stupid and dark speech, because we understand you need to protect those things as well, as long as they're not leading to violence. You need to protect those as well so that eventually you don't lose the more elevated freedoms. And I feel that way with the psychoactive substance as well. I see the marijuana and the psychedelics as more elevated and with a much better sort of benefit-cost ratio than many of the other substances. But nonetheless, the principle of sovereignty over my own mind and body, the principle that nobody deserves to be punished for what we put in our body, absent harm to others, has to apply across the board to all drugs.
Ethan Nadelmann.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for doing that. It was great. Thank you. Thank you.